To be honest with you, there are some times I think to myself, how do you actually have a real relationship with an invisible God? Have you ever wondered that? Have you ever wondered, how do you actually have a relationship with an invisible God? Well, if you've ever wondered that, you're watching the right talk, because in this series of talks, we're going to dive into how do you actually have a relationship with an invisible God. By the end of today's talk, I want to share with you just one practice from one of the ancient kings of Israel that helps us have a real relationship, even with a God that we can't see. And as a bonus, for those of you that maybe aren't church people or Christians or followers of Jesus, you're not sure about the whole Bible thing, this practice can actually help you with your mental health as well. So stick around as we dive into this topic, because this series, to be honest, is going to be a game changer, I think, for our relationship with our Heavenly Father. When it comes to relationships, I think we'd all agree that the more honest we are in our relationships, the more intimate those relationships become. It's kind of like the depth of our relationships is equal to the honesty in our relationships. When I think of my relationship with my wife or those that are closest to me, I'm reminded of the fact that I am the most honest with those that I am the most intimate with. They know everything about me. They know the good things and the bad things and everything in between. And because of that depth of honesty, there is a depth of intimacy like no other relationships in my life. You know, the reality is that our relationship with God is the same way. The more honest we are with God, the deeper our relationship becomes with Him. Let me repeat that. The more honest we are with God, the deeper our relationship becomes with Him. So even if you're not sure if God exists, I think if you're honest with God about that, it might actually help you to discover a relationship with Him. Why is this so important? Well, the reason why this is so important is because as a follower of Jesus, we want our relationship with God to grow bigger and bigger, and therefore our honesty with Him has to become bigger and bigger as well. Why is this important if you're not a follower of Jesus? Well, I'm convinced that a relationship with God changes everything, not just in this life, but in the life to come as well. Now, the most unlikely person shows us this depth of honesty in a way that, quite frankly, might be a little bit shocking for some people. As you listen to the depth of his honesty, you might be thinking to yourself, is it okay to be honest with God at that level? That even may be irreverent to some people watching this today, but this guy was honest with God in every area of his life, and he experienced God in every area of his life as well. Let me introduce you to the second king of Israel, and let's take a look at how he was honest with God. What comes to your mind when you think of that second king of Israel, King David? Even if you're not a church person or a person that's read much of the Bible, you probably have heard some stories about this guy, King David. Maybe for you, you think of him coming down to the brook as a shepherd boy and picking out some stones, those 5 smooth stones that he used when he took down the giant Goliath. Maybe that's the story you think of. Or perhaps you think of his great conquests of all the nations around Israel when he defeated all of their enemies as a mighty warrior, and he became the king of Israel, and he took them to new heights as a nation. Perhaps that's what you think of when you think of King David. Maybe it's not his highlights. Maybe for you, you think of his greatest lowlight, when he actually became an adulterer and a murderer. When he took Bathsheba, another man's wife, got her pregnant, and then tried to cover the whole thing up by killing off her husband. Maybe that's what you think of when you think of King David, the murderer and the adulterer. You think of his legacy being destroyed, his family, even his kingdom being destroyed because of those mistakes that he made. I don't know what you think of when you think of King David, but I know what God thinks of. He thinks of King David this way: a man after his own heart. You might be saying, How in the world is that what God thinks of with all of the horrible things that David did to destroy his life and the life of so many other people? Well, this practice that we're going to look at from the life of David, I think is a key to becoming known as a person or a man after God's own heart, just like King David. See, I think this practice of being completely honest with God is something that David modeled for us really well. How do I know that, you might ask? Well, we actually have access to David's journals. David's journals are found in the book of Psalms. The book of Psalms is an ancient Hebrew book in the Old Testament part of the Bible. And in this book, we see some of David's journal entries where he was brutally honest with God. When he was sad, he penned these words. Listen to this psalm from Psalm 42, verses 9 and 10. David writes, I say to God, my rock, why have you forgotten me? God, why have you forgotten me? He wrote that in his journal. Why must I go about mourning, oppressed by the enemy? My bones suffer mortal agony as my foes taunt me, saying to me all day long, where is your God? David was brutally honest. When David was mad and angry, he penned these words in Psalm 58. Break the teeth of their mouths, O God. Lord, tear out the fangs of those lions. Let them vanish like water that flows away. When they draw their bow, let their arrows fall short. May they be like a slug that melts away as it moves along, like a stillborn child that never sees the sun. I got to tell you, David was incredibly angry with his enemies. He was furious, and he didn't hold back whatsoever in being honest with God. Break their teeth. Let them vanish. Make them like a stillborn child that never sees the sun. David was honest even in his anger. But he wasn't just honest when he was sad or mad. He was also honest when he was glad as well. Listen to Psalm 66. He says this, shout for joy to God, all the earth. Sing to the glory of his name. Make his praise glorious. Say to God, how awesome are your deeds. So great is your power that your enemies cringe before you. All the earth bows to you. They sing praise to you. They sing the praises of your name. Come and see what God has done, his awesome deeds for mankind. David was completely honest with God. No matter what his emotions might have been, he was honest with God. And because of that, I believe he fully experienced God as well. Finally, even when David was scared, fearful, and anxious for his life, he was brutally honest with God. Psalm 7 says this, Lord my God, I take refuge in you. Save and deliver me from all who pursue me, or they will tear me apart like a lion and rip me to pieces with no one to rescue me. It didn't matter what emotion David was experiencing, he was able to be fully honest with God about it. And I think this practice of writing down what you're feeling and being completely honest with God about it, that's a practice that we can participate in as well. And as we begin to do that, remember the depth of our honesty in our relationships is equal to the intimacy in those relationships. So the depth of your honesty in your relationship with God is going to equate to the depth of intimacy in your relationship with Him as well. So what does it look like to be completely honest with God, just like David? I want to invite you to do something this week, to take this practice and bring it to life for you. This practice that David just taught us, I think is something that you can actually do this week. And here's how. I want you to grab a journal, perhaps like this one, and I want you just to answer 4 questions this week. Here's the first question. What are you sad about? Just open the journal and write it down. If you're a follower of Jesus, you can say, God, I'm sad about, and then write it out. If you're not a follower of Jesus yet, I still think you could just write out in a journal what's making you sad during this season of your life. It'll be great for your mental health. Then I want you to answer this second question. What are you mad about right now? Not just what are you sad about, but what is making you angry? Remember David, how angry he was? He didn't hold anything back in his relationship with God. To be honest, it was that deep level of honesty that allowed him to have a deep level of intimacy with God. So be honest with God. What are you mad about? What are you sad about? And then the third question, what are you glad about right now? What excites you? What's bringing life and joy into your world right now? Just write it out in your journal. This is the beginning of you actually writing your own psalm. And then finally, the last question I want you to write about in your journal this week is this. What are you anxious about? What's making you fearful or scared? And just tell God about it. To be honest with God is to begin a real intimate relationship with Him. Be honest with Him about what you're sad about, mad about, glad about, and what's making you anxious right now. I'm convinced that when you begin to be fully honest with God, you begin to experience God fully. That's right. When you begin to be fully honest with God, you will begin to experience God fully. That was David's story. And that was so many other people's story as well. And I want it to be your story too. For about 10 years of our lives, my wife and I, along with our 3 children, would spend every summer on a lake in upstate New York in the Adirondack Mountains. It was absolutely picturesque. Each summer we had the privilege of being able to use speedboats for skiing and tubing and just a lot of fun on the lake. The dock behind me reminds me that every time I would pull up to the dock, I would throw out the rope from the boat and somebody would grab it and they would tie it off to a cleat on the side of the dock and I'd begin pulling on the rope. Every time I began pulling on the rope, it reminded me of a famous statement from the missionary E. Stanley Jones when he said this, "If I throw out of a boat a hook and it catches the shore and I start to pull on that rope, am I pulling the shore closer to the boat or am I pulling the boat closer to the shore?" It's a pretty silly question. We all know that you're pulling the boat closer to the shore. The same is true when we are honest with God. When you're honest with God, you're actually pulling your life closer to Him. You're not pulling God closer to you, but you are pulling yourself closer to Him. And if you want a real intimate relationship that's close to God, be honest with Him. Throw out that hook from the boat of your life and begin pulling. And as you're honest and you pull on that rope, you're actually going to experience a deeper, more intimate, closer relationship with your Heavenly Father. So I want you to imagine this week, writing in your journal, imagine spending some time talking to God and being honest with Him about what's making you sad, what's making you mad, glad, or even anxious. And imagine pulling on that rope and getting closer and more intimate with your relationship with Him. Because the bottom line is this: when you begin to be honest with God fully, then you begin to experience God fully. When you begin to be honest with God fully, you'll begin to experience Him fully as well.